I've got this offcut from my office build over a year ago. It is an ash butcher block, and this was simply more than I needed, so it was cut off. Now I know what you're thinking, that would make a great cutting board. You're right. That's why I'm going to chop it up into lots of little pieces.
As you can see, there's a fair bit of wobble in this worktop cutoff. It's been lying around on my garage floor for the past year, so it's got hot and cold with the seasons, and it's put a bit of a bow in it. My plan is to actually make two things from this scrap. There is more than enough material to make a cutting board of a decent size, and with the rest I'm going to try my hand at a picture frame. I'm going to try and elevate it a little bit so it's not just 4 pieces of wood glued together, and both are going to be included in this video. After measuring the size of each block that makes up this worktop and found that it was 40mm, I then set my fence to 40mm and began cutting perpendicular to the way the blocks were running. The slight wobble in this board wasn't the only reason I wanted to resaw it and create something new. I really enjoy cooking, and I cook from scratch pretty much every night. One thing that I don't enjoy doing is sharpening my kitchen knives, and having an end grain cutting board is supposed to eliminate that a little bit. I've never been posh enough to have one before, so I thought I'll make my own. You can see the patches of stain on this piece of worktop. That's because this was a scrap, and this is where I tested my finish to decide on my office build finish. So I use my sander and go over every edge. Not only does this remove the stain, it'll also give the glue a bit of a smoother surface to stick to. I spent a bit of time switching things around so that there wasn't that consistency that you get if you just laid everything right next to where it originally came from. What this does mean is that I have a kind of lighter side of the board and a darker side of the board. However, I'd rather have that, which will fade over time, than a really consistent grain pattern. To glue this up, I simply turned every piece onto its edge grain and then smothered it in glue. Now I'm going to have to do a lot of sanding through the grits to get this cutting board as smooth as I want it anyway, so I'm going to have to clear the glue off regardless, so better to use too much than too little. The reason I'm using these massively oversized sash clamps here is because they have the flat bars to rest everything on. This ensures that when you give a little love tap with the hammer, that everything's level anyway. I'm also going to apply some clamping pressure from above just to even it all out. Using these clamps has come back to bite me though. One of the clamps had some uncured stain on it which I hadn't noticed. Anybody that's worked with end grain before will know that the end grain of a piece of wood is like a sponge, and that unfinished stain managed to soak into the end grain and no amount of sanding could get it out. Fortunately, this is just a cutting board for my home and I don't really care, but it's something to be careful of if you were making something like this to sell or to gift. Rather than just leave the garage and wait for that glue to set, I decided to use that offcut that you saw at the start of the video to make project number 2. This way I can have the two small projects go alongside each other, and whilst one's drying I can be working on the other one. Started off in a very similar way to the battens that I made for the cutting board. This time though, rather than running perpendicular, I'm going with the lengths of the battens. That way I'm cutting along the glue line and I get just solid 40 by 40 pieces of ash. I then took each one of those blocks and ran them through the table saw again, this time taking off about 10mm of material. There's no specific measurements I'm following here, I'm just going with what I think will make a nice chunky picture frame. The 30mm stock is going to be the main frame, and then I'm going to have a kind of inset on the inside, and hoping to do a bit of a colour contrast as well. And the best way I've found to make square material is to take the width of the material, press it up against the blade without pressing too much that you flex the blade, and then you can run that through the table saw to get some square material. For the glass and the backing of the frame itself, I'm going to use an old recycled picture frame. This came from an old picture frame that I got from Dunelm years ago. Dunelm's a store in England where they sell cheap things at a very overpriced rate, and they tend to fall apart after some time. Other than that though, great. I'm using the insets as a reference for where I need to cut these miter joints. I'm taking the measurement from the outer part of that insert, and then I'm just marking up roughly where my miters are going to go, just so that I don't make any little mistakes on the table saw. I set up a very temporary setup using the sliding feature on this table saw. I basically just clamped a piece of sacrificial wood to it and then ran it along until the blade went through. Now I've got that blade set at 45 degrees, and that line that I've made in the sacrificial fence I can now line up with the marks that I've made on the piece of wood. That way you don't have to be accurate, you don't need to set up fences. I'm literally going by eye, knowing that that blade is going to fall exactly where the notch is on the piece of scrap wood. I can then use the inset from the old picture frame and line up my blocks and make sure that I have created them the right size and the right length, and that everything's going to fit nice and snugly in the main picture frame, because this is just the inner frame. This is probably a good point to mention. I know this is the most inefficient way to create this style of frame. You're probably better off having the rebates cut in on a router table, or have this inner frame inset from the back so there are no gaps. I'm simply doing this as a way to practice doing the 45 degrees and seeing how close I can get them using the table saw, when traditionally I've used the miter saw. I gave everything a quick sand using 180 grit sandpaper, and I did all this by hand because these pieces are way too small to be using the orbital sander on. These smaller glue ups are always enjoyable, mainly because they go quickly and because you don't need to be rushing around with clamps. You can just do them with a length of masking tape, lay it down on the table, sticky side up, really push each part against one another so that those miters close tight. Little dab of glue in the middle, and then you've just got to make sure it's square before you put it somewhere out of the way where you're not going to knock it while that glue goes off. Those of you that are old school channel members will have seen these 45 degree clamps sitting on my tool wall since pretty much the channel began. This is the first time I think I've ever used them, and it's probably going to be the last time. They are cheap, they are nasty, and they didn't really provide anything at all. In the future, I'll just check square and just leave it to do its own thing. These brought no benefit whatsoever. With two glue ups already going on, I decided to create a third. So this is the outer frame for the picture frame, the outer frameception frame. And I'm using the piece of glass to mark two lines. After that, I'm doing a second outer line, which is the width of the block. That means I've got a guide as to where to cut the 45 degrees and hopefully create some perfect miters. Before rushing into the glue up, I decided just to try and dry fit these. The two main objectives here is to make sure the miters line up nicely and that the glass fits perfectly inside. It's not too late for me to take some material off each part as long as I do it now. If I glue it up, it gets infinitely harder. Happy with my fit, I was able to use the orbital sander this time as I had a bit more material to hold on to while I sanded everything over. One of the things I've noticed about working with hardwood is how much longer the sanding pads last. With pine, I think it's because it's resinous, it just gums up so quickly. With hardwood, the sanding pads last forever. Another thing to point out is that I haven't got my sander hooked into my vacuum. You can see the little dust collection bag on the end of it. That's important because I'm no doubt going to have some gaps in my miters because it's me. I'm going to use the sawdust that this collects to fill everything and hopefully make it seamless. Using the same masking tape trick, I laid everything out, making sure that these pieces were as tight to one another as possible, slathered on a load of glue, and then taped it all together as one frame. To make sure everything was square, I put the insert inside of the frame. It's a nice snug fit, but not too tight that it risks smashing the glass. I then use an old ratchet strap and then basically use that as the clamping pressure rather than messing around with those 45-degree clamps. You can see I've already taken them off that smaller frame because they are useless. The miters were actually looking pretty tidy, but just to clean up any small gaps, I've got that ash sawdust and I just sprinkle that on top of the glue. I've not got any extra glue on here and I just kind of rub it back and forth just to fill any gaps. There's more than enough glue and contact there to hold it together. This is just to make it look pretty. After going for some lunch and taking the dog for a walk, the glue was now dry on the cutting board so I could take out our clamps. I'm using a chisel here to take off a lot of that glue squeeze out from the underside of the board that I couldn't wipe off. And after that I used my new cabinet scraper. You guys have been on at me for ages to get one of these, and oh my word, why have I slept on them for so long? They are so gentle and safe to use and yet do such a good job at getting this glue squeeze out off. Don't get me wrong, it still looks like there's a lot because it's actually soaked into the end grain. That'll only come out with sanding, but please accept my apology. I should have listened to you sooner. To sand this bad boy, I'm going to get aggressive. I'm clamping down some blocks of wood here to hold it in place because I'm going to use the belt sander for the majority of the sanding. Now this is not recommended if you want a high-end cutting board that is used for display purposes. It will leave scratches and scuff marks because you can't go with the grain because it's end grain. However, this is going to be my daily use cutting board. It's going to be scratched using knives every single day, so I'm not too fussed about having a couple of sanding scratches on there to begin with. After sanding the bulk of the material off with the belt sander at 80 grit, I then switched to my orbital sander starting at 80, then switching to 120 and then finally 180. I say finally, I actually go over in 400 grit later, but I'll show you how I do that and the reasons for it. I only sanded the top and bottom of the board. I haven't done the edges yet because I want to add some handles and I also want to square the edges up. To square the edges up, I'm literally taking off a millimetre using the miter saw. My miter saw was just long enough that I could do this without having to flip the board over. And it doesn't matter if it's a bit rough or if there's some scorch marks on there because I haven't even sanded it yet. This next step was a bit ropey. I'm going to use this router bit here to put some handles in, but it is very small. It only measures about 7mm across, which isn't really big enough for what I want. So it's going to get a bit sketchy over on the router table. I set up 2 blocks either side of the router blade and I've fixed my fence in place. Now what I'm going to do is drop it onto that router blade. And I am going to be very careful here because this is not advised. You'll see the gap between the blocks is wider than my cutting board. This means I should get a consistent width from each side where that handle sits. I then have to flip the board over and do the same. And I should, in theory, create a nice indent where fingers can go to lift the board up. I had to do this multiple times, raising the bit up by about 1mm each time because this is a bit sketchy even for me, but I was very, very pleased with the result and I don't really know how else I would have done it. I gave them a light sand by hand just to take off any of the burr where the bit didn't quite meet in the centre, but this didn't take long at all. Those cuts were really clean and I could not have been happier with the way it turned out. I used a sanding block just to round over the tops and the corners of everything. I don't want to have a round over on this cutting board. I like the squarer edge, but I do want to round over things slightly using sandpaper just to avoid any wood chipping at all. If you remember earlier I said I do go over with 400 grit. I do, but it's by hand and it's after doing a quick water pop. I've used end grain in the past before for different projects and what I found is this is the best way to make sure that it's as smooth as possible before finish because whatever finish you use is going to raise the grain more. And I've found that skipping right up to 400 but just doing it by hand after a water pop gives the most consistent finish. And now it's time for our new segment, Cooking with Ben. I'm creating my own finish for this cutting board, and it's a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax. You can get both of these things off Amazon. I've had them for ages and I've used them in the past. First, I start by squirting as much mineral oil as I can fit, or as I have left, and weighing that out. Whatever that weight is, I then divide that by 4 and add that amount of beeswax. So a quarter of the weight of the mineral oil is beeswax. A lot of people make this finish and some people recommend a 1:3 ratio. I found this the best for allowing the mineral oil to soak into the cutting board and it not being too waxy that you have to buff it to get the finish that you want. I then need to light the stove, have a pan full of water and bring that to a simmer, not a complete boil because the water will bubble into your mixture. The idea here is that you can heat the product within the pot you're going to keep it in. I have done this directly into the pan before, but that creates a lot of mess as it cools down. You've then got a wax-lined pan. Once everything's melted together, you simply take it off the heat, and as it cools, this will turn into more of a paste. It won't be as solid as a finishing wax, it'll be pasty, like toothpaste almost consistency. After that, I can then just take it and apply it to my cutting board. All I'm using is a bit of rag here, and you can see the consistency there that we've got. It'll harden up further if I was more patient, but you cannot use too much of this stuff. You apply it liberally, leave to soak in for at least a couple of hours, preferably overnight, and then you can come back and buff off any excess. It's not the sort of finish where you need to buff to get a sheen, it's just to remove any excess. And I applied 2 coats of this in total. And with the finish curing on the cutting board, I could turn my attention back to my picture frame. I pride myself on being very honest with you guys in terms of my mistakes, and as you can see here, I'm sanding down the picture frame now that it's out of glue, and you'll notice those miters look beautiful on one side. On the other side, not so great. But this was a very simple fix. I simply got some 5-minute epoxy. This stuff's great because it's kept in separate tubes and it's sat on my shelf for over a year. I only use a tiny bit at a time. Then I mix that with some sawdust, mix it together, and just use that to fill any slight cracks on those miters. Now this is the back of the picture frame, and if this were for my home, I wouldn't bother, but this is actually a gift. I'm using GrainGuard's black ebony wood stain to finish the interior of the frame. There's a link in the description if you want to check out GrainGuard's other product. That's if I can get the lid off this one. I've had this for a couple of years and it sits on the shelf because you use so little of it to make such a big impact. The reason I prefer using this over paint is because you can see the grain of the wood through it. And because the grain remains, when you rub it with wax, you get a really cool effect. The heightened part of the grain stays black, but the wax fills the indents and you get almost this speckled effect. I applied 2 coats of stain in total and then pre-finished this with some GrainGuard wax as well. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to be using that 5-minute epoxy to glue the insert into the main frame. And if the epoxy squeezes out slightly, I don't want it to damage the stain or me to have to scrape it off and then damage the stain. To make sure that everything is as smooth as possible, I'm applying some masking tape to the front face of my frame. Again, to try and minimize that epoxy pour out. I'm going to then lay it down flat, put some 6mm spacers there as well, and then put the insert in and squeeze some epoxy into the gaps. That's the plan anyway. It does get very messy. I'm using a tiny scrap of wood to paint just the minimal amount of epoxy on the inside of that picture frame. The idea is that the insert will sit on top of those 6mm spacer blocks and should give a nice reveal. However, this epoxy, whilst appearing to be quite firm to start with, it was running everywhere. And here you can see me having a slight meltdown thinking, I'm going to have a lot of cleaning up to do. Too late now though, best crack on. I then had a further panic thinking maybe epoxy can stick to wax, so then I covered the frame, the inner frame, with masking tape as well, all the while knowing that this is 5-minute epoxy, and after 5 minutes it sets up pretty hard. So I quickly pushed that insert in, which fit perfectly, and then took a step back to let that epoxy set up. It says 5-minute epoxy, and after 5 minutes it's curing, well on its way to curing, but to fully harden it takes about 24 hours. After a couple of hours it's good enough that you can start working with it and scraping excess away. I actually left it overnight because that was the end of the day, the previous clip, and then I used a carbide scraper to scrape away the excess glue. I actually got this at the same time as my cabinet scraper, and this too is a new favourite tool. Once again, I've seen people using them and just thought, oh, I'm not going to get one of those, I'll never use it. It was £12 and it's a game changer. After scraping any epoxy or glue away, I then gave it a quick light hand sand, and now I'm applying some of my mineral oil wax combo. I really like this because it doesn't change the colour of the wood, in fact it just brings out the natural colour and just makes that grain pop. And I was very, very pleased with the look of this product. To hold the back plate in place, I robbed the hardware from the old picture frame that fell apart and just used that instead. I have had a look on Amazon though, and you can get packs of these things. They are very, very cheap, but I didn't want to order any because they come in packs of like 200, and I don't make a lot of picture frames. Seeing as though we've been on a cooking theme, we're going to do this outro whilst you watch me make an excellent sandwich. I couldn't have been happy with how both of these projects turned out. I've learnt some new skills from each of them, and each one presented just a couple of hiccups. I like it when a project has hiccups, but they're manageable. The picture frame looks fantastic, and the cutting board is sturdy and it wipes off very easily. That grain is so dense that I've got no concerns about this lasting for a very long time. In fact, the only problem with the cutting board is that the wife thinks it's so pretty she refuses to use it. She's still sticking with our old one, which is literally falling apart. And if you promise to like this video or leave a comment, then I will share with you rules for an excellent sandwich right now. Bread must be buttered, no arguments. Tomatoes must be salted and peppered if you're nuts. Cheese must be freshly grated. Don't buy the bag nonsense, and don't be putting big slabs in a sandwich. Your sandwich should contain a heart-stopping amount of mayonnaise, and you should cut it top to bottom. That way each half of the sandwich has got a top crust and a bottom crust. Then you can't pick a favourite one to eat first. Thank you for watching. Take care.